Howdy, friends. This is Matthew Sewell, and you're listening to episode 106 of the Popecast, a history of the papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non-boring stories on the successors of St. Peter, and a reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before. And on that note, this is an excellent show coming at you today. All the world's problems have happened so many times in the past, and I think there's no better guest to explicate that than Dr. D.P. Curtin. He's the founder and editor of the Scriptorium Project, which is an initiative of collecting, preserving, and translating the body of surviving documents from all over Christian antiquity. So I think they say from the 4th to the 15th century is what he lists on the website there. But it's translating the body of all of these old documents that have been only existent in languages other than English, mostly Latin, as you'll hear him talk about, but all sorts of others. To date, the project's releases have pulled from the Greek, Syriac, Georgian, Armenian, Nubian, Frankish, Visigothic, Punic, Nordic, German, Roman, Celtic, Ethiopian, and Coptic traditions of Christianity, as if that's not enough. And they've been pulled from all sorts of local traditions and languages to boot. The goal is to make these available to the wider world to read and digest for themselves. And they're not just ebooks. We're talking real published paper copies of these various compilations. He's got a really robust Amazon author page, but you can find it all on his website that he lists at the end of the episode. And all of these were pretty much completely forgotten by the modern world until their translations at the hands of Dr. Curtin and the Scriptorium Project. So, at any rate, I'm not blowing white smoke when I say I immensely enjoyed this conversation and appreciate it all over again when editing this to publish this episode. So I hope you're edified by it as well. Enjoy the show. Well, welcome back to the Popecast. Dr. D.P. Curtin is our guest this week. I'm meeting him in person for the first time as we're recording this, but I think we've been mutual followers on Instagram for some time now. He's the creator and publisher of the Scriptorium Project, and we'll get a lot into that as we go today. But just to get us started, who are you? What's your background? How did you get into all of this? We'll get into the relevance to the Popecast, I think, in particular. But yeah, what kind of started this and your interest in it?
Well, there's a short and a long response to that. The short response is that as an undergraduate, I was very interested in the early church, the medieval church, which is great, but I ran across this regular barrier. There was a lot of things I wanted to read that were either in Latin or in medieval Greek, or were just totally inaccessible. They existed, and there's a book of them somewhere, which you could find through like the card catalog of the university. But trying to get it was basically impossible. You'd have to wait like 2 months, and then when you did, it was like a week, or it would be like a 300-year-old book, and they're not going to allow you to touch it. So this is kind of born out of the accessibility of old texts. Wanting to be able to know in the primary source something that actually happened, the words of important figures of the church, of saints, people who are related to kind of the boots on the ground of what was taking place as a secondary source, not as somebody commenting on it later, the thing itself. And so the Scriptorium Project's built entirely around that premise, being able to take texts that were inaccessible for a variety of reasons and being able to put them out there so that everyone has them and has access to them at any time.
Yeah, I found it just really, I don't know if it's just me because I'm a nerd with this type of stuff generally, but I really can see very clearly how big of a gift this is just to get a glimpse into it. Because like you said, there's the proximate need of it just not being available in English, and you were, researching whatever it might have been, but then also just generally society assumes things about the High Middle Ages or the quote unquote Dark Ages or whatever it might be. But these actually give little glimpses into one example I thought of, like how much things cost or what the tax from whatever kingdom might have been. I know the document you sent me as an example from North Africa. What was it? knuckle handles or something. I forget the exact phrase of grain that they took off the top of every bag,
Yeah,
for instance.
yeah,
But yeah, all that stuff is fascinating that otherwise I think would more or less be lost, right?
yeah. The whole world's. I mean, we think of our culture as being distinctive, but there's so much of it that goes into the past and how it's been informed by the past. And it's just kind of lost. And in the context of the church, how do you talk about certain saints without talking about the cultural context they were kind of thriving in? So for me as an undergrad, I was at Villanova, and St. Augustine, the school is run by the Augustinians, who are now very famous because of the recent election.
Yeah, indeed.
Augustine was the dominant figure. But the world that Augustine was living in is not our world. And even when he's portrayed in medieval art, it's not that world either, where he's very like, it's very medieval. There's all these like high Italian bishops with very delicate embroidery on their clothes. He was growing up in a very different place that would be almost entirely alien to us.
Right. I totally agree. And it probably just totally boggles the mind. There's always the jokes that people say, "Oh, if you had a time machine, what would you do?" "Oh, I'd go back to when Jesus died or something like that." And it's like you wouldn't it would just, you'd be so far removed from what real life is right now. I was curious, so it seems like you had a pretty even split between Western and Eastern church texts, but then you also seem to have uh, an affinity for things out of the Irish church in particular. But what do you have a kind of a preference, or have your preferences changed for the types of letters that you've enjoyed translating or enjoyed learning about as you've kind of
Um,
embarked this? You said for about 20 years now, right? That you've
yeah.
been doing
So
this.
in 3 weeks, it'll be 20 years. My background is much stronger in Latin. The world of Greek is a lot more complicated. In Latin, there's variation, but Greek, there's different types of Greek. Like my background in terms of academic training was something called Athanase, which is the Greek that's spoken in Athens during the time of, say, Socrates. The Greek used in the Gospels is very different. It's Koine, as opposed to the Greek that you'd find in like high medieval documents. Dealing with the Eastern Church is very challenging just because of the shifting Greek, which is mostly the lingua franca, but there's also other languages, and trying to be able to either work with other translators or get Latin editions. So working with the Coptic Church, because I don't know Coptic, and that's a pretty difficult language to be able to track down. Same thing with Syriac, the biblical Aramaic. Very pivotal language, but trying to find someone who speaks it or translates from it is basically impossible or cost prohibitive. So we're pretty much limited to what is still a spoken language, like Greek, Georgian, Ukrainian, and with the West, Latin. Most of my work has been with the Latin side of things just because it's easier. I could do it myself and it's far more accessible. I love the East. It's just there's so many barriers there. And that's one of the reasons why it still remains relatively mysterious to most Western Christians.
Hmm. Yeah, rightfully so. I mean, you mentioned Pope Leo the 14th, obviously, but that was one of the very first things that he said after he was elected, that the Western Church could adopt some of the mystery, which I couldn't help but resoundingly agree with. But
Yeah.
as far as your inspirations or kind of mentors along the way, what were kind of some of the signposts in that sense? Like who helped you along the way? Were you kind of started picking up the mantle of this sort of thing? I know you've translated far and wide now, but what was kind of your inspiration as far as the professors maybe or
Yeah, so
other
there were some
translators?
living people attached to it, and a great mentor in the person of Father Thomas Martin, not to be confused with the Jesuit who's James Martin. That's a different thing altogether. Tom Martin was an Augustinian who was very interested in patristics, distinctively in the works of Augustine, and trying to be able to take Augustinian spirituality and make it more accessible. The idea of taking the early church fathers, which are a considerable part of the church, but it's something that a lot of people are just unaware of. How do you take the wisdom and the wisdom of centuries at that and make it accessible to people? And that was a lot of his operating procedure. He kind of gave me the initial foundation for all of this. Looking back at people who have tried similar things in the past, there's people like Giovanni Manzi, 18th century, who also collected all of these works of the church to try to make them accessible. But he's been dead for the last 240 years, and all of his works are in Latin. So a similar effort, but perhaps trying to be able to contemporize that a little bit so that it's in a language that's vernacular and that we can understand, and that anyone will be able to get at. There are other ones who kind of follow that. There's the French Jesuit Jacques Miguier, who did the same thing around the time of the American Civil War. He has these large collections which still populate seminary libraries, but it's the same issue. Again, it's Latin and Greek. Mm-hmm. And towards the end, he tried his hand in Syriac, I believe, which didn't go well.
Interesting. Yeah, it would make sense that, Latin being the lingua franca of the church for so long, but now, for better for worse, as much as we may like or dislike it, English is becoming more the lingua franca of the world. And so it only makes sense to, carry on the torch.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was very convenient for Latin to be in that position because you could go from Britain to France to Italy to the United States to South America, and you'd just be speaking the same language. So as an academic language, it was fantastic. And to be involved and usually even admitted to a university, the expectation is that you would have some level of fluency in Latin. The issue right now is nobody speaks Latin, nobody reads Latin, and we have libraries full of these Latin texts that are just slowly rotting, which is a scary situation to be in. There's some value to the archive movement, archive.com, where we can scan documents that they don't totally vanish, especially before someone has a chance to actually read them.
Yeah. So as far as your own interests, I realize there's the language limitations with, just accessibility and cost to translate some of the Eastern literature. Is there a particular era that you've found that you have just been particularly fascinated by after you read and translated a particular document, whether it's in the West or the East?
I find in terms of my own working method, I get fascinated with a particular era region for a little while and try to be able to get access to as much as possible, put it out there, and then kind of like move on to something else. So you mentioned the Irish church, which was definitely a big one because, I mean, I am exceedingly Irish. Go by DP. My first name is Dermot because most Americans can't pronounce that, so I don't even try anymore. But growing up, there was always talk about St. Patrick, but there was nothing else. So what was the early Irish church that Patrick laid down? And there's a difficult situation because there were clearly a lot of documents at one time. Monks are famous for a few things, one of which is constantly writing. Those books, those texts which told us about the early Irish church are largely gone, either through the destruction of the Viking raids in the 9th and 10th century or the wars of religion during the 16th and 17th century. A lot of the documents that I found are from the Church of Ireland, which is an Anglican body, because Catholicism wasn't even legal in Ireland until 1829. So there's not going to be a lot of continuity of documents. And some of the documents that did exist within the Irish Catholic Church found their way to France, where they were just kind of hanging out in a library in Auxerre for a few centuries.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like you could imagine some small group of monks as the monastery is burning, throwing all of their letters on a boat that just left and then happened to land in France or something like that.
Yeah, you see a dispersion of things, especially in an era when older books had to be copied by hand. It's not like there's an instance case like today where you can have a book and a month later it can be found anywhere across the world. Books are expensive, they're slow to copy, people make mistakes, or in a lot of cases just add things in as they feel like it. Sometimes the notes or the introduction of texts are also very telling because books are expensive to even publish, even in the era much later with Gutenberg. So you'll find like royal patronages, like this book was dedicated to the court of King Charles V, who died in 1556. Almost like relics, little fossils that you find in books sometimes that don't really exist in any kind of modern text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on that topic, I was really interested. You had sent me, what was it called? Letters from Medieval Christian North Africa, which
Yes.
I confess to having known next to nothing about, other than some of the figures who obviously were in it. So in the name of Saint Leo IX, Pope Saint Leo IX, and then Pope Saint Gregory VII. So I was excited to read what you sent me as it is because it was, again, a lost document from 1,000 years ago, or lost documents, I should say. But then, to my surprise, they're two of my favorites, but who next to nobody has heard about. So you can imagine my excitement as I read those things. But maybe we can kind of zoom in on that in particular, on that region and what was going on there, because you
Sure.
kind of talk about in the introduction, it was one of the very first sees of Christianity in North Africa, that being Carthage. But then it basically has disappeared. It doesn't even exist as a titular see, like as a title that's given to archbishops anymore, which
That's right.
I didn't even realize that it was completely suppressed in 1964. So maybe just a brief overview of that, and then kind of maybe some of the characters from that era that you resonated with and what they were what they were all about.
So, to the uninitiated, North Africa was a major hotbed of early Christianity, especially the city of Carthage, which is a very old city, which is right on the tip in modern Tunisia. In ancient days before that, it was Rome's major political enemy for centuries, spawning the three Punic Wars. But after Rome conquered it and kind of resettled the area, it became a major Roman city. So when Christianity arrived, it spread relatively quickly, not only in Carthage, but in all the areas surrounding there. And you see figures like Tertullian, the early church father, Cyprian, I'd mentioned St. Augustine earlier, all of which kind of laid the foundation on our major factors in the Western church. It's just that most people recognize, I see this place as being really important, and I notice now there's nothing there.
Right.
So the short version of the history is that while St. Augustine was dying in the city of Hippo Regius, the barbarian tribe, the Vandals, had come down from Scandinavia into Spain and were physically dismantling the city of Hippo Regius as he was in bed. They conquered all of North Africa in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and they set up their own kind of barbaric kingdom, which had a lot of issues because the Vandals themselves were Arians. They were not Catholic Christians. Eventually, the Eastern Roman Empire decides that they're going to retake it, and they retake the Vandal kingdom as well as Italy during the time of the Emperor Justinian, which goes, well, for about a century, until you have the arrival of the Arabs, who come out of the Middle East, sweep into Egypt, into Libya, into Carthage, and at that time, we don't know what happens after that. They take the city, and then suddenly the lights go out, and we don't hear anything ever again. And that happens around the year 700.
Wow.
So the jump between a thriving metropolis of Christianity, because we see that the Vandal king had a synod of the church in the year 486, and you can look, and it's just page after page after page of bishops. So Christianity is thickly immersed into the culture. But by the year 1000, which is when you have at least one letter who was written to Pope Leo, we might have 2 or 3 bishops who are mentioned. So clearly, a collapse of not only the church there, but of the former Carthaginian civilization.
Right. Well, maybe for reference, just to briefly interject for reference for listeners. So the United States of America has 194 Latin dioceses, I think it is. I used to sell software to dioceses. That's the only reason I know that random number. But they have, we probably have 250 bishops serving as either ordinaries or auxiliaries. So I think in that document in particular, it said there were 205 at that council or at that synod, and then at the time of the writing in 1053, I think it was, there were 5 left.
Yes.
So it's like, imagine Seattle, New York, Denver, Houston, and I don't know, Miami are the only bishops left in the United States. Would be, I guess, maybe for reference. So more condensed geographical, but anyways, I thought that was, yeah, very striking.
Yeah. So clearly you have almost the total collapse, and trying to be able to gain insight in other places, like in the alleged Dark Ages in places like France and England. We have documents. We can kind of roughly put together what happened because while there's not a lot of them, there's still a few that happen every few years, so that we can kind of create a rough reconstruction. What was taking place in North Africa? There are no letters for like 200 or 300 years there. The only letters that do exist are letters that are coming from the papacy down to Carthage saying, "How are you guys doing?" And we don't know what the response was, whether that doesn't survive.
How much
Maybe there
time do you have,
wasn't
Holy
one.
Father? Yeah.
We do know that there are other references distinctively in Rome. There's the Bishop of Carthage who's residing in Rome in the 8th century, and he's said to be in exile. But we don't know why he was in exile, because the Arabs aren't writing anything down, and whatever documents existed were just thrown into the fire. So one of the reasons the Augustinians have such a strong presence in Italy, in fact, the hermits are originally from Tuscany, is we got a lot of the followers and relics associated with Augustine were evacuated out during the Arab conquests and brought to a place they thought would be more politically safe for them.
Mhm. Okay, interesting. So by the time we get to, Leo the Ninth and Gregory the Seventh, I noticed one style. I feel like I don't typically pick up on these sorts of things in, the flowery writings of thousand-year-old papal documents. But it was pretty apparent, and it's been a while since I've read about either of them. But I do remember style-wise. I think Leo the Ninth. There was a contemporary biography written of him. I don't know if you've heard it or not, but that he was extremely emotionally expressive, a very holy man, very manly man, a good strong pope as far as it goes, but also was just moved, had the gift of tears times like 5. Like he said,
Yeah.
it was said that he cried all the time, and he was just very moved by the Spirit, I guess. And then Gregory the Seventh was just kind of shoot from the hip, seasoned papal diplomat, but maybe ready, fire, aim kind of guy, where he spoke before thinking all the way. Or it was especially prickly as far as how his words landed, and rightfully so. I guess you had to speak a certain way. But I noticed that in particular in the two, they were writing 7 or 8 years apart in the
They're pretty
mid.
close together, yeah. I think we're talking
Yeah.
about like the 1050s. So there's a lot happening. Uh, Gregory, well, at the height of the Middle Ages, there's a lot of popes who are very much politicians who are kind of forced to be in that role just because of the nature of the time. My recollection is that Leo was what you're describing. He was an unusual character for that, because to be a politician in the 7th century, you have to be a pretty rough character. There's a lot of personalities. There's a lot of machismo and a lot of pushback. So you have to be able to stand your ground, especially the head of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. Well, because it was only 50 years after the Seculum Obscurum, more colloquially termed the pornocracy. But it was like the low point of the papacy, when it was John the 12th was one who basically was gifted the papacy, was murdered by the woman who he was in bed with, her husband, caught them in adultery. Like, that was the Pope at the time. And then not long after, I think it was after or before, after, I think, was Benedict the Ninth, who was Pope 3 times. And the papacy was rescued by the guy who Gregory the Seventh named himself afterwards. So this is only 50 years afterwards. So yeah, you're totally right. And then here they are trying their best to, I guess, encourage a sad situation where the last few bishops were trying
Yeah.
to make some sense of how to run the church when it's almost dead in North Africa, right?
And Carthage in particular, was probably number 2 to Rome in the West. So you mentioned the Patriarch of Carthage, which they maintained titularly until 1964, until the Second Vatican Council. They did the same thing, I think, with Constantinople as well.
Mm-hmm.
There was an attempt at revival at several points. Certainly, there were a lot of Italian merchants going back later. Everyone knew Carthage. Carthage was this major city. But the decimation that took place in North Africa, it's even telling in language. So we talk about Romance languages today, Latin being so dominant in the West that effectively things like Italian and Spanish are dialects of Latin with some Germanic interjections into them, which is true. But North Africa was also heavily Latin speaking. Tunis, Algeria, Morocco, Libya, all of which had a very strong and distinctively African Romance language. That has been almost entirely eradicated. There's no traces of it left. There's like glimmers maybe in Berber, but even still, it's not like what you would see. So in terms of trying to reconstruct what the African church was, that becomes a real distinctive issue, because it's not really like anything else paralleled in the Western church. So even when in places like France when the barbarian invasion took place and the church collapsed for several decades. It's eventually revived and it continues to flourish, and they take those ancient Roman elements into the later medieval French, and it becomes the church that we're familiar with today. With North Africa, there's this dead stop. It's as if like the whole civilization just stopped. Would love to really be able to understand what was it like to be a Christian in North Africa at this period, to understand exactly what was taking place. So the life of Augustine at Villanova, all of the depictions of him are very Italian looking. So you have Augustine dressed up as a medieval bishop. He's in these large scale cathedrals, all of which have this kind of high Victorian Gothic in the background. Not really what you would really expect.
Right.
So what was the African church really like? We don't have an African liturgy. The Mozarabic probably kind of parallels it. We know they were certainly using Latin, but what else was taking place? It's usually the state of affairs that old documents are maintained by the church in monasteries, in episcopal libraries, and especially in Rome. The Vatican archives are enormous. But if there's no successor, if there's no survivor from that, what happened to these things? It sounds like at one point they just stopped manufacturing them, and the successors to it were no one. And I think that's probably something valuable to look at in the context of where I'm at here in the northeast of the country, where you do have a large number of parishes that are closing. I think in Pennsylvania and New York alone, there were 900 closures in the last 10 years.
Oh my gosh, right.
No, the Catholic Church is growing substantially in this country, but it's not in this sector.
Yeah, actually, it's funny you mentioned that because I was trying to think of parallels. Obviously, first world problems in the U.S. where we, Archdiocese of New York still has 2 million odd Catholics on paper, at least. But realistically speaking, that's probably your example is probably the closest thing that we can think of. And I remember it occurring to me I was in Rome last year, how a year is longer than we think, but 100 years is shorter than it feels like as far as the full flowering of history. So these things are protracted. We're thinking, okay, in the lifespan of America, 250 years, we see the North African church go from kind of hanging on to gone. And then you start to kind of understand what that might start to look like, where, there's just these massive swaths of, I guess, secular population, for lack of a better term. In our time, it was Muslim conquest back then.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just interesting to think about, and I guess a little frightening, but also encouraging, I guess, that the church survives elsewhere, but just kind of tragic to have to reckon with.
So it becomes a study in exactly how does the church survive under difficult conditions? Because you're right, being able to contrast the 300 years between the church in Carthage being at its apex, near 700, near 1,000, where it's almost entirely extinct. That's the same difference between us and roughly the colonial era. So, like when George Washington is born and Ben Franklin is relatively young, it's a different world, but like we're still talking about something that's still familiar to us. If we're looking at the question of how to be able to have the church flourish and avoid its extinction, I think North Africa is probably a great study. There are other ones. Certainly the church in Nubia, modern Sudan, was very prevalent up until the 16th century and then was just quashed. And there's a situation that they're doing a lot of work in, Polish researchers trying to piece back together what the Nubian church was. Arabia, prior to the time of Muhammad, had a large number of Christian communities at Petra, at Najran, that all vanished. They were either exiled or executed. So it becomes a question of, okay, we see what happens when the church is not given what it's needed in terms of the ability to flourish in these regions. How can we apply that to our current situation where we do see the church growing some places and kind of falling off in others?
Yeah.
Especially here in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Another piece of that's related that I noticed that I was reading those documents. So I think they spanned the documents. It was like 1050, and then the last one maybe was around the mid 13th century, something like that.
There's some Franciscans that they're given permission to go in from a local little Arab chic.
Right.
Because North Africa was still remembered. There's still memories of these places of being an important city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there was increasingly smaller and small. I think those letters noted a couple of different times, or maybe in your summary at the beginning, it noted that it was a huge Christian civilization, 200 odd bishops, whatever, to at the end, these little tiny bright spots in the mountains outside of city centers, all these types of things. And then what you slowly start to see is they have to adopt Arabic as their language instead of Latin. They have to adopt certain, I guess, maybe Islamic cultural signposts or certain things that they have to end up adopting. And so when Christians from the West start to encounter them, papal legates or whoever it might have been, they see a different practice of Christianity just because they've been completely shut off from
Yeah.
the source of life, I suppose, for lack of a better term.
So, in terms of communication, once the conquest takes place, there's very little way of being able to get through. And to be able to send anyone into these new territories, it requires political affiliation, it requires rights to be able to send missionaries and monks to be able to reestablish contact. So, in contrast to North Africa, places like Egypt, which you have a large Christian population that was able to survive Islamic persecution, and they were able to do that even to the current day. And being able to communicate between Christians in Egypt and Christians in Rome, even though we're not talking about a large geographic distance in terms of like the US comparison here, that was something that was almost impossible, because how would you do that? What would be the purpose of it? So effectively, there's a lack of communication between Rome and Alexandria for 1,000 years, until the Council of Florence, when they decide, like, hey, we really don't need these divisions. Let's try to get the band back together.
Right. Yeah. I think in terms of right practice, right worship as well, you can understand, because obviously, yeah, the lines of communication are very open for us here. But
Yeah.
if you think of a geographically large diocese, I grew up in the Diocese of Helena, Montana, which is larger than Ireland, our bishop would always say. But there was always little pockets where priests would just want to run things their way, would not make any waves, but then would just do things how they wanted to do them, for better or for worse, left or right. I hate using those terms, but like you get the idea, liberal, conservative, whatever. But there was always a lot more kind of keeping the diocese at arm's reach. And so you have that in 10, 100, tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold in this case, where Rome can't reach an already distant region for centuries. Then what happens in terms of, the faith being sustained, I suppose.
Yeah. Some regions were able to sustain it on their own in terms of connection. I really like the Ethiopian church. So there's a few Ethiopian documents from the High Middle Ages, and we know that they had contact with the church in Rome, because they start using Latin words for the first time in 1,000 years.
Interesting.
There's one document that uses the word Adventus, like Adventus Christi, Advent.
Mhm.
That's not an Ethiopian word. But clearly contact was reestablished in a profound way, because there is no way to be able to communicate between the highlands of Ethiopia and the city of Rome, both for geographic reasons, but the expense, and also how would you do that? The mechanics of that would be really challenging. It's really only in the modern period where you've mentioned that communication has really taken off. And we see the rise in ecumenism as well. But at this point in history, during the Dark Ages, the power of communication is very limited. So the great Roman roads, the Pax Romana, you could communicate from Britain to Syria without any complications. That came to a crashing end, and people didn't know what to do. You see Christianity kind of developing these small enclaves, these pockets, and they develop distinctive traditions. It's just has Rome has a limit in terms of what it could do to communicate, and it also had its own issues internally, trying to maintain the integrity of the church against various invaders, the Lombards, the Ostrogoths. So it became a question of self-preservation for so long.
Sure. I just read something last week, I think, of all really randomly, that we're having this conversation now, but it was from John Henry Newman, which I'd never read before. I'd never seen this snippet from him before, how he spoke about how in Augustine's time, a lot of the priests and bishops didn't really help quash the heresy, functionally speaking, and it was largely these small pockets of faithful laity who kind of kept the church alive and encouraged their bishops. But yeah, I thought it was interesting that it's encouraging in some way too, because we see some of that now, where the church is growing is, faithful younger people, younger families, younger priests increasingly who kind of encourage that. And John Henry Newman said that too. Priests weren't always super negligent, but at that point, bishops, for whatever reason, just ended up getting kind of removed from their people and the real problems that were facing Christianity at that time. But the church still flourished and still made it through the, Christological heresies at that point. But I wonder if it was kind of the same in this age that we're talking about too.
So North Africa is distinctive. When it comes to heresies, during the time of Augustine, there was the Donatists. These were a group that survived the Roman persecution under Diocletian and said that if you renounce Christianity to the emperor, the last real pagan emperor, then you needed to be rebaptized and go through everything all over again. Kind of this the purity cult that existed. Very, very harsh, very draconian. Augustine spoke against them, but it was a distinctive feature of the African church. There's really almost two churches here. There's the Catholic Church, and then there's the Donatists, and they're in constant conflict with one another. And part of the reason potentially for the lack of survival is this split. The church wasn't able to stand fully united when the various waves of conquest came. There's also an issue of when the Arabs came, there's lots of things that are imposed on the conquered population. Part of it is the financial tax that's put on them, where they're effectively paying twice as much as everyone else. And if you would ask someone in America today, you can practice any religion you want as long as you pay 80%.
Right.
You're going to be very, very certain that that's the thing that you're dedicated to. Right. And so you do see that with the Copts. But in North Africa, for whatever reason, it didn't seem to hold as firmly. It does appear that a large portion of the population, the gentry, the intellectual class, got up and left. They fled to Sardinia, most likely. They fled to Italy. We see Carthaginians in Germany, which had to be something, wow, especially during like the 8th and 9th century. But the lack of the intellectual class meant that there really wasn't any in-depth conversations taking place anymore. I feel like that's probably something that's significant here, because we as Catholics have this significant intellectual, cerebral tradition that we can attach ourselves to. And it's a vanguard from the rest of the world who tries to act in a polemic way. Mm-hmm. If that were to disappear, I think that would be really damaging. So trying to be able to encourage Catholicism in the spaces of the university, which hopefully are still teaching things that are Catholic, might be asking too much with some Jesuit institutions.
Yeah, one thinks of, have you ever seen the movie Idiocracy?
Yeah.
It predicted so many things 30 years ago that we're encountering now, where it's the loss of an intellectual depth in civic life, probably, right? And so there's an interesting corollary or an interesting analogy there, I think, that over, several hundred years, if there's no intellectual class, not in terms of like an elite, but as far as the people who are reminding us that it's more than just going to mass and praying, not that those are not sufficient, but that to have a robust faith societally, there's more that needs to be incorporated into the wider culture, I suppose.
So I don't want to say that like we should have a robust, that everyone should be an intellectual. I can imagine a plague of 1 million intellectuals just devastating society.
Right.
Correcting each other's grammar. But what I think is important is that intellectuals in societies, they drive the cultural conversation. And so much of the cultural conversation is usually at least partially attached to religion. So what happens when those people are gone? They've got out of Dodge in the last chopper. I can think that there's no longer any conversation about Christianity, about the past, about what it means to be attached to the life of the church. And so it's like a flock without a shepherd. Mm-hmm. People become dispersed. As frustrating as Episcopal authorities can be from time to time, they do stand in to make sure that the integrity of the church is maintained across time and across distance.
Right. Yeah. a couple of things come to mind. One, like you said, yeah, a million intellectuals would be not a good thing. But it's the Saint Therese quote, you know, if all the flowers were the same, the world would lose its loveliness, is kind of the quote that comes to mind. And then also, I don't even know that it's the worst. I think it would be worse if the more than just the conversations stop, is that the conversations keep happening, but badly, something along those lines. Because you think, again, an allegory to our political life now, it's just an increasing decline into like stupidity. You watch, you know, mainstream news, and increasingly like, do these people have more than two brain cells to rub together? I think you lose the intellectual class. I don't even know that it's that the conversations stop entirely. It's that they keep attempting to happen, but if you just cut off the head of all of that depth, then you just end up navel gazing. And I wonder if that precipitates or speeds up the decline.
I would think so. So there are people that are looked to in societies and civilizations that are considered sentinel characters. I mean, even though we're talking about North Africa right now, I mentioned three sentinel characters of Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine. These are the people that are kind of setting the pace for the civilization of how things should be. And even in our own day, people who love Augustine and even know Augustine, but they haven't read Augustine. They don't know everything that he has to say. His general message is going to come across, but the particulars of it will probably be missed. Just with people who are Catholic influencers and Catholic podcasters who are out there right now, who are trying to be able to spread the message, there's a general sense of what's out there to be able to push. No one individual is able to do it effectively on their own. But if you remove those people, if you remove the influencers, so the bishops and intellectuals of ancient North Africa are effectively the influencers of the 7th century here.
Yeah.
They're telling people about the culture and commenting upon it. If they vanished tomorrow, would there be a culture left? Would there be anything left at that point?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's been a tremendous loss in the United States of our cultural integrity, because you're right, intellectual life is not something that's considered to be a virtue here. The selection of virtues that we have are relatively poor. So there's a question of, how do you maintain the integrity of American civilization, of American culture, if there's nothing left in that culture worth saving?
Yeah. Well, that's a broader topic probably for another podcast, but yeah, it was an interesting allegory, and I want to be just mindful of time. So, this has been a really great conversation. So the last question I have is one I asked to every guest on the Popecast, and so if you want to keep it condensed to this era or the era that you've covered, great. If you want to broaden it out to all 2,000 years, that's fine. But who would you consider your top three favorite pontiffs from history?
Favorite or most colorful?
Oh gosh, I mean that could be, you could do both if you want. I don't care. But
I think
if you go for most colorful, the favorite in that category, that might be a more entertaining answer. I don't know.
so. Certainly, and I say this as a psychologist here, a conversation with Alexander VI would be fascinating.
Yes.
I would not put him anywhere close to the category of favorite in any capacity. Some of the stories that are circulated about him, the banquet of chestnuts, assuming that it is even true and it's not apocrypha, would be really interesting to understand his mindset of where that, so much why, especially as the head of the Roman Catholic Church. On a more reasonable level, maybe Sylvester. I can't remember if he has a numerical. He was in the early 4th century.
There's at least two, because I know he's Sylvester the First, but he's Saint Sylvester, right?
His presence at the time of Constantine, I'd love to know exactly more about exactly what that looked like. Certainly there's Latin texts that give biographical information, but how accurate those are, especially when they're composed like 12 centuries later, I suspect that there's probably a lot of hagiographical material there. Same thing with Pope Damasus, who's later on in the 4th century.
Right.
I'm going to go with, as a third pick, Eugene IV, who was middle of the 15th century.
Okay. For him, what would be the reasoning? Is that as far as like a colorful, entertaining one, or is that like a true favorite?
No, that's that's a legitimate one, like Alexander the Sixth. Uh, Probably some significant psychological questions there. Uh, Eugene or Eugenius, he was an interesting cross section because you're talking about the end of medieval civilization and the papacy's involvement in that, and especially the birth of communication with different worlds. So he oversaw the Council of Florence, Florence Ferrara, which initially involved communication with the Greek Church under the emperor, and then extended to the Armenians, and then the Copts, and then the Ethiopians. And this must have been a very exciting time. Council of Florence accidentally triggered the European Renaissance, so a sudden interest in ancient texts and the life of the mind. That I mean, if I could go back, that would be the place that I would go with my time machine. Talk to, I guess, with Platon.
Yeah, with some reasonable expectation of being able to, find your way around speaking or writing the language.
Yeah, that might be a little bit of a barrier there, but that world, I mean, it's the collision of cultures, and usually when that happens, there's a lot of excitement.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, it's safe to say you are the only guest so far who has picked Pope Eugene the Fourth, but that's a great reason. I mean, I love the most the obscure stories from papal history because they're just so illustrative that humans enjoy and appreciate the same things, similar things throughout history. It just kind of keeps cycling around kind of the same joys, pleasures, sufferings, all that type of thing. I think that's really encouraging. Well, yeah, I know you have to run soon, but before we go, where can people find you, find the Scriptorium Project, any pet projects within that you'd like to promote? All the above.
So you can find the Scriptorium Project. There's an Instagram handle, and there's also a website, the scriptoriumproject.com. It's relatively easy to be able to navigate. You'd mentioned the two columns for the Eastern and Western churches, and under that, it's broken down by region. So the North African church, which is called the Punic church, Visigothic, Italian, German, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, all of which contain multiple volumes in there and are constantly expanding. To be able to find the books outside of the website, you can also go pretty much anywhere. I think we have something like 40,000 distributors at this point. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Google Play, you name it. The intention is to be able to get that out there. But all of the sales are, the United States, UK, Australia. Every so often we get some odd random country, for some reason exploding in Uganda right now. I don't
All
fully
right.
understand.
Hey, good. Yeah, that's great. Well, yeah, I know I personally, I think I have 3 or 4 in the cart right now from before we started recording that are just old, obscure papal documents that I'm really excited to read. So yeah, Saint Leo the Third. I think there was some from Gregory the Seventh. There was some more from him. There was a letter I hadn't heard of from Leo the Great in there, but there's just a ton of really, really good stuff.
Yeah, Leo the Great was very prolific. And papal documents, I'm very frustrated with medieval grammar because things aren't very well spelled out. But if it's working for a pope or the Vatican in general, I mean, those documents are very well written, very adroit. They're a pleasure to work with. Remember working with some Visigothic king. I think he had the unfortunate name of Sissybutt.
Right.
But like reading him, I just wanted to pull out my hair because he clearly had no idea how Latin grammar or even the mechanics of language work.
That's so funny. Speaking of things that occur today that still occurred back then, right?
Yeah.
People were bad at grammar back then too. Excellent. Well, yeah, Dr. DP Curtin is the guest. The Scriptorium Project is the project, I guess. Yeah. So please, please, please go check all of that out. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Would love to have you on again to talk about some other obscure corner of Christian history. But yeah, this has been a joy. Until next time. Well, there you have it. Great episode. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. One last little feature before we go. So we're introducing a new segment called the Popecast Mailbag. So anybody who's following us on Instagram might have seen this a couple days ago. So we'll just be kind of going through a couple rapid fire questions to close things out. All right. Our first question. What is a papal bull? Care to simplify? Yeah. So a papal bull is basically an official decree by the Pope. So technically it comes from the Latin for bulla, like Bulla, which denotes the lead seal that would I guess have the papal coat of arms on it. The term papal bull apparently wasn't really used until about the 12th or 13th century, and it was really just used for the most important documents that were released by the popes. I could be wrong, but I think an encyclical or an apostolic exhortation, like a teaching document, is distinct from a papal bull. Just a couple of examples, which I thought were helpful for this answer. So, examples of papal bulls: canonizations of saints, the like dogmatic pronouncements, so the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption of Mary, which was in 1954 by Pius XII, if I'm not mistaken, the restoration of the Jesuits in 1814. No comment beyond that. But John Paul II, Pope Francis, both announcing the Jubilee year of 2000 and 2025, respectively, were given in the form of a papal bull. And then obviously are much less significant, so to speak, much more kind of, I guess, routine pronouncements that help the life of the church. That would be a papal bull. So again, comes from the Latin for bulla, and something to do with the registrum bullarum, the register of bulls, which kind of the list of papal bulls was kind of what it was referred to once it started to become a more common practice in the Middle Ages. So hope that's a help. All right, that was Paul Adam _UY. The Great Inquisitor. Is Pope Leo XIV really the first Augustinian pontiff? Doesn't that title belong to Adrian IV? Adrian IV. So this is the funny thing with religious orders. So Franciscans, there's like 80 gazillion Franciscan orders and offshoots of the original Franciscan religious order. It does say that he was a member of the Augustinian order, a canon of it, but maybe it was like a third order kind of ancillary member of it. He did join an Augustinian monastery, but Adrian IV, again, was famously the first and only English-born pope. Nicholas Breakspear was his baptismal name. But yeah, I guess he was an Augustinian monk. So technically, I guess Leo XIV, maybe the second Augustinian pope. So there you go, the Great Inquisitor. Thank you for the question. And the first question, I posted, they said Araceli, in reference to Santa Maria in Araceli in Rome. So in order to solicit questions for this, in the, I don't know if it's a basilica, in the Church of Santa Maria in Araceli in Rome, it was the first church that I went to when I visited Rome last year with my great friend, Father Ned Scheidecker, happily a priest of the Diocese of Helena. We right when I landed, I think I was a zombie because I had flown technically overnight, but it was during the day in Rome. Araceli was the first church that we went to visit, and there, I think it was right next to the tomb of St. Helena. Interestingly enough, because I grew up in the Diocese of Helena, Montana, named for St. Helena, the mother of Constantine. Right next to her tomb was this really unappealing statue of Pope Leo X, famously the Pope who ushered in the Protestant Reformation because of his stupidity, for lack of a better, or intemperance, I should say, for lack of a better term. But just this really chunky, unappealing statue of him. And he wasn't the most slender of a figure, but he certainly wasn't as rotund as this statue depicted. So one wonders if maybe he had certain feelings about the sculptor, or maybe it was sculpted after he died. I don't know. But at any rate, yes, the statue of that chunky saintly or Pope Leo X was in the Church of Santa Maria in Araceli. So, well, that does it for our first segment of the Popecast mailbag. Thank you as always for listening. Be sure to support us, subscribe on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to support us if you'd like. You can, let's see, the easiest place to do that now would be at our Substack, Today in Papal History, to become a paid subscriber. over at popes.substack.com. We're trying to kind of simplify things. So the Patreon has been deprecated, but the the Substack newsletter has been kind of the central place where we'll be publishing both the podcasts and the newsletters. Thank you all for listening. We really appreciate your patronage, whether you're a free or a paid listener and reader of the Popecast and Today in Papal History. And above all, never forget, these are strange times we live in, but they are no stranger than an ages past. Until next time.